Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are getting into Spain and their vast empire. All right, so ruling an empire. American conquests made Spain the wealthiest nation in Europe. They were bringing in just loads of cash from defeating the Aztec and the Inca Empire. Now, this really does transform Spanish society. They go from being one of the poorer European nations to being the richest one, and it happens reasonably quickly. Now, the empire itself then has to be managed. And as we've learned, empires that are too big are really difficult to manage. So Spain's getting ahead of the curve on this one by dividing up their empire into two large regions. We have the northern section, which is Mexico, the Caribbean, it's called New Spain. And the southern part, which includes South America, is just referred to as Peru, not to be confused with the modern state of Peru, but this is where it gets its name. Now, each region was governed by somebody called a viceroy. This literally means vice king, or second to the king. And they were all powerful in their region, except for where the king gave them explicit orders. Now, settling the empire became, a task. This is a large area, and sending Spanish settlers over to help control that empire becomes something that Spain has to figure out how to do effectively. Now, they do this by creating three different types of settlements. The first are called pueblos. Now, the Spanish pueblos existed for trade. They would have a small number of Spanish people living in these pueblos, and they would manage trade with the local inhabitants. And then trade goods would go from these pueblos to other pueblos and then on to the Spanish themselves. Missions were another one. There are a large number of Native Americans in the region. And how do you try to control those populations? Well, one was through conversion to Christianity, creating that common link, that common thread between the Spanish ruling class and the Native American subjects, was to convert them to Christianity. The third were called presidos, recognizing that sometimes things don't go well. You do need forts. You need a military presence. So presidos were these forts that popped up usually near pueblos in order to protect them in case protection is needed. Now, the social classes in New Spain became complex and somewhat rigid. New Spain and Peru had this strict social class. It was really determined by birth and by race. So your social class was set when you were born based upon who you were. We have peninsulares up at the top. You had to be born in Spain to be up at the top. Creoles are the next step down. Your parents are Spanish, but you were born in New Spain. Next rung down is Mestizos. So your parents, you have at least one parent with Spanish ancestry, but you also have Native American parents. Below that are Native Americans, and below Native Americans are the enslaved Africans, usually brought over from Africa or the Caribbean. Now, peninsulares are the top. These are people of the peninsula. We're talking about the Iberian Peninsula right here. So the peninsulares come from Spain, sent by the king specifically to do some sort of governmental or military task. Now, the Creoles and Mestizos descend from Spanish parents and are born in New Spain. Creoles usually have large land holdings, but less political power. So these are the farming class, the plantation owning class. They're making a lot of money in New Spain, and they're making that money by exploiting the local labor or enslaved labor and by sending those goods back to Europe for trade. The mestizos are the children of Native Americans and Spaniards. There was a lot of mix, especially since many of the Spanish merchants and soldiers that come to the New World are men, not women, and they eventually want to settle down and have families. Well, to have a family, they need a wife, and there are just Native American women around. So we wind up with a lot of mestizo families. Mestizo families tend to be farmers, craftsmen, soldiers. They operate kind of the lower rungs of the middle class within New Spain. Now, natives have the lowest free status within the society. Now, what does it mean to be free? There's varying degrees of freedom for Native Americans within the society, and we'll get more into that later. But the Spanish considered Native Americans as a whole to be free individuals, but of low status. They were paid for labor, but frequently not paid enough to survive. So this creates a problem. Indebted natives were then not free to move until they pay their debts. So the system here is you pay your Native American employees so little that they can't afford to buy the food they need to survive. You then loan them money to buy the food that they need to survive, but now they're trapped on the land. They're not allowed to move until that debt is paid. And you make sure that they're never paid enough to move. Now you have basically a new enslaved class. Imported African slaves, however, are considered at a lower level because they are actually considered property rather than individuals who just happen to be in debt. And much more to come on the horrors of African chattel slavery in the Americas. We'll definitely get into that. But that's a future lesson. That was all for today. I hope you did learn something about New Spain. We've got more coming, but that's all for today. Thank you and farewell.